At an extravagant benefit gala, a woman entered with a grace that instantly drew whispers among Chicago's elite. Once the overlooked wife of a powerful mogul. Her arrival sent subtle shockwaves through the glittering crowd, especially when their eyes collided. What truths hid behind her calm smile? And how far had she risen to stand here tonight? The scent of champagne mingled with the faint aroma of polished marble floors. The charity event was alive with grandeur, a dazzling display of status disguised as generosity. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in soft gold, illuminating guests draped in velvet and silk. Laughter bounced off the marble walls, blending with the delicate music of a live string quartet. Beneath it all, glances darted, secrets whispered, motives cloaked behind cordial smiles. Vivian Marshall stepped through the grand entrance with the poise of a woman who had mastered the art of appearing unbothered. Her champagne-colored gown, cut to hug every curve, drifted around her legs like liquid satin. Tiny diamond studs adorned her ears. A slender bracelet glittered at her wrist as she clutched her metallic clutch. To the watching crowd, she was elegance itself. Calm, stunning, untouchable. Yet under the soft fabric, her heart drummed an erratic rhythm, a battle between pride and the raw wound no one here would ever see. She told herself she belonged in this room, but her skin tingled with the ghost of old humiliation. But deep inside, a familiar ache pulsed, the sting of betrayal she carried like a hidden bruise. She paused at the top of the sweeping marble staircase, then descended slowly into the ocean of eyes now turning her way. Not out of admiration, but speculation. Everyone here knew who she was, Mrs. Vivian Marshall, faithful wife of the famed Alexander Marshall, a self-made tycoon whose empire spanned luxury hotels, soaring office towers, and sprawling golf resorts. For years, she had been the quiet pillar behind his public success. Tonight, however, the same people who once overlooked her saw something unfamiliar, something burning behind her calm exterior. Inside, that flicker was a promise to herself. Never again would she be silent, never again dismissed. She found him almost instantly, Alexander, beside the champagne fountain, laughing with a cluster of influential executives. His crisp black tuxedo accentuated his broad shoulders, and the platinum cufflinks at his wrists caught every flicker of chandelier light. But it wasn't Alexander's presence that made Vivian's breath catch. It was the woman clinging to his arm, Sienna Royce, dressed in crimson silk that draped over her figure like a promise. She leaned so close to Alexander's shoulder, her flirty laughter rose above the hum of conversation, her painted lips curved in a knowing smirk. One manicured hand rested on Alexander, as if she owned every piece of him. Sienna radiated the bold certainty of a woman convinced she'd won. She wasn't just another socialite. She was the one Alexander had left Vivian for, and she didn't bother hiding it. Vivian's fingers clenched tighter around her clutch as she watched them. But she refused to let the jealousy drown her. It crawled up her throat like acid, but she swallowed it whole, reminding herself that no one here deserved to see her bleed. The humiliation of knowing her husband, the man she had molded her life around, had swapped her steadiness for a fleeting thrill burned deep inside her. But she wouldn't grant him the satisfaction of seeing it break her. Tonight wasn't about Alexander or Sienna. Tonight was about her. A waiter drifted by with a tray of champagne flutes, and Vivian accepted a glass, more to keep her hands occupied than for the taste of it. The chilled bubbles slid down her throat, but did little to calm the knot in her stomach. Her pulse drummed at her temples, each swallow an anchor to hold her steady. She swept her eyes across the glittering room, preparing herself to glide through this ocean of socialites and power-hungry businessmen who lived for whispers and scandal. If she played her cards right tonight, she wouldn't walk out as the pitied wife. She would leave as a woman in control of her own story. And tonight, she silently vowed, they would remember her name long after the last toast faded. As she moved through clusters of guests, offering polite nods and practiced smiles, her mind replayed her best friend Maya's words from that afternoon. "You don't owe him a thing," Maya had said firmly. "But if you want to remind him of what he threw away, do it for yourself, not for revenge." Maya's voice echoed in Vivian's head now, steadying her as she approached a small circle of donors gathered near the raised stage. They were deep in discussion about the city's after-school literacy program, an initiative Vivian had poured months of effort into. Her passion for the cause came from her own childhood memories of crowded classrooms and forgotten neighborhoods. But tonight, that passion would be her edge. Mrs. Holloway, one of the key benefactors, turned and greeted her with a warm handshake. "So good to see you, Vivian." Vivian's smile was flawless as she slipped right into the conversation. "It's wonderful to see you too. I hope you're as excited about tonight's auction as I am. The funds we raise will truly transform these schools." Within moments, she had the entire group hanging on her words. Her genuine energy and deep knowledge of the project made her magnetic. She wasn't just a pretty face or Alexander Marshall's forgotten wife. Tonight, she was a presence, a force. Each nod of approval sent a quiet thrill down her spine, a promise that she was rewriting who she was right in front of their eyes. With every word, she felt pieces of her confidence stitching themselves back together. She could sense it, heads turning, subtle shifts in the way people looked at her. They saw her now. Across the ballroom, Alexander's eyes found her. His laughter stuttered to silence as he took in the vision she had become. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe regret. Then it vanished when Sienna leaned in, whispering against his ear, reclaiming his focus. But Vivian had already turned her back on him. She kept circling the room, greeting philanthropists, shaking hands with investors, exchanging polished small talk with board members. Each smile was precise, each word intentional. She wasn't just collecting polite nods, she was building alliances that would outlive this glittering night. The more people she won over, the clearer her new path became. She didn't need Alexander to thrive. She never really had. She never had. As the auction segment of the night drew near, Vivian quietly slipped away from the buzzing crowd and made her way to a discreet office tucked behind the ballroom. Inside, she found the event coordinator, a man she had worked side by side with for months leading up to tonight. He handed her a folder, holding the final paperwork for her significant pledge. It was a calculated step, one that would cement her standing in the city's philanthropic circle and firmly establish her as a serious benefactor on her own merit, not as Alexander's accessory. She signed her name with a calm hand, her pulse quickening not from anxiety, but from the rush of taking back control. When she stepped out and rejoined the ballroom, she carried a spark she hadn't felt in years. The thunderous applause that followed the auction rattled the chandeliers, and when the winning bid was announced, Vivian Marshall's name, gasps of approval swept the room. For the first time in far too long, the spotlight burned for her alone. She accepted the wave of admiration, and across the room, she caught Alexander's eyes. His face was hard to read, but something about his posture had shifted. Gone was the easy confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. Sienna's dazzling smile faltered, her eyes flickering nervously between Vivian and Alexander, as if she too sensed the sudden shift in power. When the applause faded, Vivian returned to her seat, a small but undeniable smile curling at her lips. Tonight wasn't about humiliating Alexander or overshadowing Sienna. Tonight was about remembering herself, her quiet grace, her unwavering resilience, her strength that needed no audience to exist. As the gala wound down and guests drifted out into the cool Chicago night, Vivian lingered by the ballroom's grand doors, watching them go. She didn't glance back at Alexander. She didn't need to. Her path was hers alone now. And this was only the beginning. The vast Marshall estate lay wrapped in an unsettling hush that Vivian had come to know too well. The sweeping staircase, the massive crystal chandelier overhead, the priceless canvases lining the hallway, symbols of success she had once trusted to mean security. Now they felt cold and heavy, relics of a world that had drifted painfully out of reach. She moved through the dim corridor, the quiet click of her heels echoing off polished marble, a lonely sound in a house that felt more like an echo chamber than a home. She pushed open her bedroom door, her sanctuary through countless nights spent alone, while Alexander played the charming host to investors or, more recently, entertained Sienna. The room was pristine, every detail in its place, but the king-sized bed still looked impossibly wide for just one person. She set her clutch down gently on the nightstand. She slipped out of her gown and into a silk robe. Catching her own reflection in the vanity mirror, She paused, studying the woman staring back at her. For a fleeting moment, she almost didn't recognize this version of herself. Calmer, yes, but brimming with something she hadn't felt in too long: defiance. "You're stronger than this," she whispered under her breath. Her phone buzzed, snapping the stillness. Glancing down, she saw Maya's name glowing on the screen and let a faint smile tug at her lips. She answered and settled onto the edge of the bed. "I was wondering when you'd call," Vivian said, her voice softer than usual. "You think I'd miss my chance to hear every detail?" Maya's warm, familiar voice washed over Vivian like a balm. "Tell me everything. Did you see him?" "I did," Vivian admitted, her words drifting into the quiet. A heavy silence followed, the weight of it making Maya hold her breath on the other end. "How bad was it?" Maya asked gently. "Not as bad as I thought it would be," Vivian said, tracing her fingertips along the intricate stitching of the comforter. "I expected to feel furious, humiliated even. But I didn't. Standing there, seeing him with her, I realized he didn't have the power to break me anymore. Watching them together just reminded me how far I've come." Maya exhaled a soft sigh. "You've been through hell, Viv. I'm proud of you for showing up tonight. I know that wasn't easy." "It wasn't. But I had to do it," Vivian said, leaning back against the headboard. "I needed to prove to myself that I'm more than just Alexander's wife. And tonight, I really felt it." Another pause. Then Maya's tone shifted, firm but curious. "So, what now? You're not just going to let him walk away with everything, are you?" Vivian shut her eyes, weighing the question she'd carried for months. She had hovered so long on the thin edge between fighting back or walking away quietly. But tonight, standing in that ballroom and feeling the power in her own voice had cracked something wide open inside her. Something fearless she hadn't touched in years. For once, the fear was smaller than the fire. "I've been thinking about it," she said steadily. "And I know what I have to do." Maya perked up immediately. "You have a plan?" "Not exactly," Vivian confessed, glancing at the mahogany bookshelf across the room where rows of business manuals and financial reports collected dust. She'd spent years sitting in on Alexander's meetings, scribbling notes, learning details she never imagined she'd use. Now, all that knowledge felt like ammunition, power she could finally claim. "But I have an idea, and I know where to start. I'll need help," she continued, her mind already racing ahead. "I know people. Some of Alexander's old partners who left the firm under ugly terms. If I reach out to the right ones, they might talk." "You're thinking about hitting his biggest development project, aren't you?" Maya asked, a mixture of excitement and worry woven through her voice. "Biggest project," Vivian said, her fingers tightening around the phone. "He's poured millions into it, but he stretched himself too thin. If I can find a way to undercut him, take control of the key assets, it could flip the entire balance of power." Saying it aloud made her pulse race, but also lit a dangerous thrill low in her chest. Maya hesitated. "Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "This isn't just business, Viv. It could get ugly." "I know," Vivian replied firmly. "But it's not about revenge. It's about taking my life back. I can't just stand by and watch him thrive while I'm left scraping myself back together. I need to do this, for me." Her voice didn't shake this time. Every word anchored her deeper in her own resolve. Maya let out a slow breath, her resolve settling. "Then I'm with you. Whatever you need, I'm here." "Thank you," Vivian murmured, her voice softening with gratitude. "I'll keep you posted." After hanging up, Vivian crossed the room to her bookshelf. Her fingertips skimmed the spines until she pulled out a thick binder packed with notes from the countless meetings she'd sat through at Alexander's side. She flipped through the worn pages, memories flooding back. Late nights listening to his smooth pitch, watching him charm investors, admiring his brilliance before that brilliance soured into pure greed. She traced faded ink with her fingertip, the ghost of her old self flickering behind her eyes, and then vanishing. One entry made her pause, the detailed outline of a luxury condo development in the center of Chicago. It was Alexander's crown jewel, his boldest vision, but also his biggest gamble. The land deals had been tangled, the permits constantly stalled, and the construction costs had ballooned beyond projections. If there was a weak link in his empire, this was it. The next morning, Vivian sat at the marble kitchen island, coffee cup in hand, phone balanced against her knee. She had already drafted a list of people, developers and employees, old partners, anyone who might know something useful. One name leapt out at her: Daniel Richards. He had once managed big projects for Alexander, but quit after a nasty fallout. Daniel had always been kind to Vivian, loyal even, sometimes venting to her about Alexander's impossible demands and ruthless deadlines. Without allowing herself time to second-guess, Vivian typed out a message. "Hi Daniel, it's Vivian Marshall. Hope you're well. I'd love to catch up if you're free this week. There's something important I'd like to discuss." She hit send and set her phone down, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. It was just one small move, but it was a move. For the first time in years, the next step belonged to her alone. And that was all she needed right now. Later that afternoon, as she organized stacks of folders in her sunlit home office, her phone buzzed. She snatched it up. Daniel had replied. He agreed to meet her for lunch the following day. Relief flooded her veins, chased quickly by a hard edge of determination. If she was going to go up against Alexander, she couldn't afford a single misstep. She had to be strategic, meticulous, unflinching. The next day, Vivian arrived at the small cafe she had chosen for their meeting. The place had a warm, rustic charm. Exposed wooden beams across the ceiling and the comforting scent of fresh bread drifting through the air. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the cafe as Vivian spotted Daniel sitting by the window, his laptop open and a mug of coffee steaming at his elbow. He looked up the second she approached, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Vivian," he said, standing to greet her. "It's been way too long." "Far too long," she agreed, slipping into the chair across from him. They chatted politely for a few moments, but Vivian didn't bother with too many pleasantries. She leaned in, her voice dropping just enough that only he could hear. "Daniel, I need your help. I know you left Alexander's company on rough terms, and I'm sorry for that, but I need you to tell me what really went wrong with the condo project." Daniel's expression shifted, curiosity flickering behind a layer of guarded caution. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I'm going to take it from him," Vivian said simply, her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. Daniel leaned back, studying her, then slowly, a spark of respect touched his features. "If anyone can pull that off, it's you," he said. He closed his laptop and leaned in. "All right, I'll tell you everything." He began laying out the cracks in the project, the spiraling costs, the delays that had turned deadlines into jokes, the big investors losing patience. As Daniel spoke, Vivian felt a fire spark in her chest, a feeling she hadn't tasted in so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't drifting. She was steering. The future was hers to carve out, not just survive. This wasn't just about knocking Alexander down. This was about building something of her own, something no one could ever strip away. And she knew, deep in her bones, this was only the beginning. High above the city, on the private rooftop terrace of Alexander Marshall's penthouse, the skyline shimmered like an ocean of diamonds. The breeze carried a hint of the river mixed with the faint hum of traffic far below. Alexander lounged back in a cushioned chair, a glass of bourbon loose in his hand. His dress shirt was open at the collar, the day's deals and half-spun lies still clinging to the corners of his weary smile. But up here, beneath the soft terrace lights, he wasn't the unstoppable businessman. He was just a man drunk on comfort and convinced the world still bent to his will. Across from him, Sienna Royce shifted in her ruby silk robe, the fabric catching the light as she crossed one leg over the other. Her dark hair tumbled down her bare shoulders and her crimson lips curved into a knowing grin. She twirled the base of her wine glass between two fingers, her eyes dancing over Alexander with amusement and a trace of cold calculation. "You seem tense tonight." Sienna spoke, her voice smooth as the vintage red she sipped. "Rough day at the office?" Alexander let out a quiet laugh and swirled the amber bourbon in his glass. "Just the usual. Investors wanting promises, contractors whining about missed deadlines, board members acting like vultures. Nothing I can't handle." Sienna's lips curled into a sly smirk. "You always say that, but even you have limits, don't you?" He raised an eyebrow, the dig at his pride sparking a flicker of irritation. "I don't have limits, Sienna. I have setbacks, and setbacks can be handled." Sienna leaned in closer, resting her chin on her palm, her eyes glinting. "You mean like the delays on the condo project?" Alexander's jaw stiffened, but he hid it behind another sip of bourbon. Just temporary headaches. The land buy was trickier than the lawyers predicted, but I'm meeting with the zoning board next week. Once that's done, everything will fall back in line. Sienna murmured, her manicured nails tapping an idle rhythm against her glass. You sound so sure. But confidence only takes a man so far. What if this project doesn't bounce back? It will, Alexander snapped, the firmness in his voice leaving no room for debate. I've invested too much to watch it collapse. Sienna leaned back again, her smirk never fading. I'm sure you'll figure it out. You always do, don't you? Her tone was airy, almost teasing, but a razor edge lingered just beneath it, one that Alexander didn't miss. He narrowed his eyes, studying her carefully. Sienna had always been all praise and silk affection, or so she made him believe. But tonight, something in the way she pushed and prodded felt different. Like she was gauging him, testing how far she could bend him. Are you doubting me? He asked, setting his glass down with a quiet clink on the sleek table between them. Sienna shrugged, the silk of her robe slipping slightly off one shoulder as if by accident. I don't doubt you, Alexander. I just wonder how long you can keep all the balls in the air. You have the condo mess, the downtown hotel overhaul, the commercial site on Fifth, and now, the gala fallout. Alexander's teeth ground together at the mention of the gala. He tried to brush off what had happened, tried to convince himself Vivian's little show of power meant nothing. But watching her stand in that spotlight, grace carved into every word she spoke as the applause washed over her, he hated that it had rattled him more than he'd admit. She wasn't supposed to stand out. She was supposed to fade away. The gala's done, Alexander said curtly, his tone clipped and final. It doesn't matter. Sienna arched a perfectly shaped brow, unimpressed. Doesn't it? She made quite an entrance, and that donation has everyone talking. Let them talk, Alexander shot back, leaning into his chair, postured defiant. It won't change anything. Sienna watched him in silence for a moment, her narrowed eyes calculating. You're underestimating her, she said quietly. I know women like Vivian. They disappear long enough for you to forget they exist. She snapped her fingers, and then they strike. If I were you, I'd keep an eye on her, Sienna said softly, her words slicing through the quiet hum of the city below. Alexander's gaze darkened. Vivian doesn't have the means to threaten me. Sienna let out a gentle laugh, a sound smooth as silk drifting through the night air. Maybe not financially, but you'd be amazed what people can pull off when you underestimate them. Her comment irritated him, but he masked it behind a calm facade. He pushed himself up from the chair and wandered to the terrace's edge, staring out at the sprawling skyline he'd helped sculpt with years of deals and ambition. From this high above the streets, everything felt under control, far removed from the messy realities brewing below. But Sienna's warning clung to his thoughts like a splinter he couldn't ignore. Vivian had always been his steady anchor, the quiet mind behind the scenes, offering sharp advice he'd too often taken for granted, never needing her name in headlines. But the woman who had stood beneath those gala lights wasn't the same patient wife who used to wait up, hoping he'd come home before dawn. She was stronger now, unpredictable, and that made her dangerous. Sienna joined him at the ledge, sliding her arm through his. Relax, Alexander. I'm not saying she'll destroy you. Just watch your step. He exhaled and turned to face her, forcing a thin smile. I appreciate the concern, but I have everything under control. Of course you do. Sienna's lips curved as she leaned in to brush a slow kiss against his cheek. Just don't get too comfortable. As the evening drifted on, they returned to their lounge chairs, glasses refilled, conversations slipping into their plans for a lavish getaway in Monaco. But while Sienna's laugh filled the rooftop, Alexander's mind was miles away, back on Vivian, and the uneasy suspicion that this time he might have underestimated the wrong person. The next morning, Alexander stepped into his office tower downtown, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the restless pulse of Chicago below. His assistant handed him a thick stack of reports, the top folder marked with updates on the condo project. He flipped through the pages, his brow knitting tighter with each line. The delays were worse than he'd been told, the cost overruns more aggressive than his finance team had projected. He made a mental note to drag the project manager into a meeting before the day was out, but before he could lose himself in the numbers, his phone buzzed. An email from one of his biggest investors glowed on the screen, thinly veiled worry about profitability and an impatient demand for reassurance. Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, raking a hand through his hair. He despised showing weakness, especially to the people who trusted him with millions. But the cracks were widening, and for the first time they weren't so easy to plaster over with charm and a handshake. By midday, Alexander sat in a sleek conference room, flanked by his top executives. Ideas flew back and forth: cut costs, strong-arm suppliers for better rates, delay non-essential upgrades, but none of it felt like the clean fix he desperately needed. "We could look at selling off part of the land to raise quick capital," one executive suggested. Alexander shook his head sharply. "No. Selling off assets is a last resort. We're not there yet." "Then we'll need fresh investors, sir," another added carefully. Alexander nodded, though the thought made his jaw tighten. Bringing in more backers meant giving up slivers of control he'd built his entire reputation on guarding. He had always believed no one could steer his empire as well as he could. But now, with pressure mounting from every side and Sienna's pointed words gnawing at the back of his mind, he couldn't help but feel the sting of something unfamiliar, the sense that his iron grip was slipping. Later that evening, back at the penthouse, Sienna greeted him at the door with a soft kiss, her perfume curling through the air. But Alexander barely noticed. He brushed past her, poured himself a double bourbon, and sank into the living room armchair, eyes fixed on the skyline beyond the glass walls. For the first time in years, doubt pressed at him like a hand on his chest, and it wasn't just the condo project eating at his confidence. It was Vivian, too. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall bay windows of Vivian's study, washing the rich mahogany desk in a warm glow. What had once been a showpiece room, designed more for prestige than practical use, now buzzed at the heart of her strategy. Stacks of financial reports, legal binders, and architectural sketches covered every inch of the polished wood. Vivian moved among the chaos with a calm efficiency, her fingertips drifting over figures and signatures as if she'd been doing this her entire life. The faint scent of fresh coffee and ink lingered in the air. The only sound was her pen scratching across the margin of a document. She paused, tapping the pen against her lower lip while she scanned the latest financial breakdown of Alexander's prized condo development. The numbers read like a cautionary tale. Ballooning costs, missed deadlines, investors losing patience, exactly the soft spot she'd been waiting to strike. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She straightened her shoulders and called, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Daniel Richards stepped inside, a laptop bag draped over one shoulder. In his early 40s, with streaks of silver in his hair and a leather jacket that had clearly weathered more than a few boardroom battles, Daniel's eyes swept the room before resting on Vivian. She rose to greet him, extending her hand. "Thanks for coming, Daniel," she said. He clasped her hand firmly. "You sounded pretty serious on the phone. Figured I'd better see for myself." "It is serious," Vivian said, gesturing toward the chair opposite her. "I need your help navigating the mess Alexander's made of the condo project." Daniel let out a dry chuckle as he sank into the seat. "Calling it a mess is generous. I told him more than once he was biting off too much, but you know Alexander never hears a word when he's convinced he's right." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the edge of the desk. "What exactly are you planning to do?" Vivian's lips curved into a small, resolute smile. "I'm going to acquire the key pieces tied to the project: land parcels, supplier contracts, and development rights. Once I control those, Alexander won't be able to advance a single inch without coming through me." Daniel let out a low whistle, clearly impressed. "You've done your homework." "I've had plenty of time," Vivian replied, her tone steady and cool. While Alexander was busy parading around as a visionary, I was paying attention. She slid a folder across the desk to him. Inside were meticulously organized notes and financial breakdowns. "These are the pressure points. The land acquisition is the linchpin. Secure that, and the rest will crumble in our hands." Daniel flipped through the pages, nodding as he absorbed the information. "I know the developer who holds the adjoining parcel. We worked together a while back. If he's still strapped for cash, he might jump at the right offer." Vivian leaned in closer, her eyes glittering with a quiet fierceness. Then let's make him an offer he can't turn down. Daniel closed the file and leaned back, studying her intently. You've changed, Vivian. Last time I saw you, you were the quiet one in the corner, taking notes while Alexander hogged the room. Now look at you. You're the one steering the ship. Vivian's smile stayed soft, but there was iron behind it. I'm done being quiet. The days that followed blurred into a whirlwind of calls, meetings, and discreet negotiations. Vivian pushed through it all relentlessly, her mind operating like clockwork as she orchestrated lawyers, developers, and financial advisors. She moved deliberately, knowing any hesitation could tip Alexander off too soon. But this wasn't just about blocking him. It was about building something entirely her own. At night, when the house was hushed and the city glowed beyond her window, Vivian sat in her bedroom armchair, reviewing contracts on her tablet while the rest of the world slept. The loneliness that used to fill these hours was gone, replaced by a bright, consuming determination. For years she had poured her time and loyalty into Alexander's ambitions, silencing her own dreams. But not this time. This time, the dream was hers, and she would not let it slip through her fingers. One particularly late night, her phone buzzed with a new message from Daniel. Land deal secured. Papers ready to sign. Vivian exhaled slowly, feeling the sharp thrill of victory spread through her chest. She typed back immediately, confirming the next steps, then set the phone aside and sank back into her chair. It was happening. The puzzle pieces were snapping together. Soon, Alexander would have no choice but to face what she had done. The next morning, she sat across from her lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Rachel Porter, known for dismantling even the most ironclad corporate defenses. They met in Rachel's sleek conference room, walls lined with shelves of law books and framed degrees, the polished table gleaming under the soft light. Rachel spread the final contract between them, her crimson nails tapping lightly on the stack of papers as she laid out the stakes. Once you sign this, Rachel said evenly, you'll hold the controlling stake in the development rights and all key assets tied to the project. Alexander won't be able to move an inch without your signature. Vivian nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the smooth barrel of the pen before lifting it with steady hands. She signed her name in bold, unwavering strokes. The gravity of what she had just done pressed around her, but instead of feeling crushed by it, she felt lighter than she had in years. She slid the signed contract back to Rachel, a spark of quiet triumph igniting in her chest. This wasn't about revenge or proving Alexander wrong. This was about stepping out from his shadow and shaping a future with her own name on it. Later that afternoon, Vivian met Daniel at a small cafe tucked on a busy downtown corner. The warm buzz of clinking cups and low chatter wrapped around them as they settled into a corner table. Daniel lifted his espresso, eyes shining with a mix of disbelief and admiration. "You did it?" he said, setting the tiny cup down with a soft clink. "I'll be honest, I didn't think you'd pull this off this fast." "I didn't have the luxury of time," Vivian replied, stirring her tea. "Alexander never leaves gaps uncovered for long. I had to move before he noticed." Daniel leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his grin widening. "So what now? Now?" Vivian's voice was calm but resolute. "I let him discover it himself. I'm not hiding any of this. When he realizes I hold the reins, he'll have no choice but to come to me. And when he does, I'll be ready." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "I would pay good money to be a fly on that wall." Vivian's smile flickered, but her mind was already miles ahead, planning, preparing for the inevitable clash. She knew Alexander wouldn't simply yield. His pride wouldn't let him, and that was exactly what she was counting on. His blind spot for underestimating her. By the time he grasped the truth, she would be too far ahead to stop. As the sun dipped low, turning the city streets to molten gold, Vivian strolled back to her car, her heels striking the pavement with a steady confidence. The world felt charged, as if the air itself had tilted in her favor. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was owning every step, and the taste of it was more intoxicating than any wine. Back at home, she slipped off her shoes in the kitchen, poured herself a glass of deep red, and let the quiet wrap around her. But for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel lonely. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace with herself. She had spent so long living in the shadows of someone else's grand ambitions, but now she was the one casting the shadow. As she sipped her wine, a small knowing smile tugged at her lips. This was only the beginning. Alexander Marshall sat at the head of the long, gleaming conference table in his downtown high-rise, his eyes locked on the thick binder of reports spread out before him. The morning sun streamed harshly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, throwing unforgiving light across the room, and across the tension carved deep into his face. The easy confidence that usually cloaked him in these boardrooms was gone, replaced by a brittle awareness that problems were piling up faster than he could swat them away. His fingers drummed against the table's polished surface, a sharp, steady rhythm that betrayed the frustration simmering beneath his calm facade. Inside, a storm of disbelief and bitter pride clashed violently. How had he let this slip so far? He flipped to the latest construction update, eyes sweeping across rows of numbers that seemed to bleed more red ink with every line. Shipping delays, surprise permit holdups, subcontractor disputes, every possible snag was bleeding his luxury condo project dry at once. And worst of all, the investors he'd once dazzled with promises were turning skeptical, restless and more vocal with every meeting. Their last quarterly update had been a disaster, a firing squad of questions he couldn't fully answer, their doubt hanging over him like a blade waiting to drop. He could still feel their narrowed eyes, the way their polite nods concealed a quiet judgment that his magic had run out. "Mr. Marshall?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Donovan is here to see you." Alexander exhaled through clenched teeth, slamming the binder shut with a dull thud. "Send him in." Moments later, Richard Donovan, his CFO and one of the few people who still dared speak plainly to him, walked in carrying a laptop and a folder brimming with reports. Richard looked just as wrecked as Alexander felt, tie loosened, eyes bruised by too many sleepless nights. "I take it you've reviewed the latest numbers?" Richard asked, sinking into the seat opposite him and dropping the folder onto the table. Alexander leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose to ease the tension crawling up his skull. "I've seen them. What I want to know is how we fix this, before the board decides to scalp me at the next meeting." His voice was calm, but beneath it coiled the raw fear that for the first time in years, he was out of clever tricks. Richard sighed, flipping open the folder and sliding a crisp printout across the polished table. "We've pinpointed the major bleeding points. The building materials we sourced from Europe, they're stuck in customs, and we're being charged storage fees for every extra day they sit there. The subcontractors want more money, labor shortages are killing us, and the zoning commission is still dragging its feet on approving the new specs we submitted." Alexander's jaw flexed as he skimmed the document, the list of setbacks reading like a personal insult to his legendary control. Every line, a tiny rebellion he couldn't charm or bully back into place. His empire, his invincible shining empire, felt suddenly fragile under his clenched hands. "And the investors?" he asked, his voice low but edged in steel. "Are any of them close to bailing?" Richard paused a heartbeat too long. And that silence was all the answer Alexander needed. "Richard," Alexander pressed, his tone dropping into that dangerous calm that left no room for half-truths. "Don't sugarcoat it. Tell me." Richard cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. "Two of our secondary investors have started voicing concerns. They haven't pulled out yet, but they're quietly asking about exit options. If we don't show major progress by next quarter, we might lose them." Alexander leaned forward, elbows planted firmly on the table, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. The stakes had never felt higher. This project wasn't just another jewel in his crown. It was his personal declaration to everyone watching that he could conquer any obstacle and walk away victorious. But for the first time, that victory felt alarmingly out of reach. A flicker of panic sparked in his gut, immediately buried under his ruthless instinct to regain control at any cost. "We need a new strategy," he said finally, voice low but resolute. "I am not losing this project." Richard shifted again, clearly bracing for impact. "There's another issue. I didn't want to bring it up until I could verify the details, but..." He paused, then pressed on. "The parcel of land next to our site? Someone else bought it." Alexander's head snapped up, His eyes narrowed into sharp slits. "What do you mean, someone else? We had a verbal agreement on that land." "We did," Richard said carefully, weighing each word. "But the seller took another offer before we could lock it in. They sold it to someone else." Alexander pushed back hard from the table, the chair legs screeching across the polished floor as he stood. "Who outbid us?" Richard hesitated again, then met Alexander's furious stare head-on. "Vivian Marshall?" For half a heartbeat, the name didn't register, his mind refusing to wrap around it. But when it sank in, disbelief collided with raw anger in his chest. He turned and stalked to the window, glaring out at the Chicago skyline as if the city itself had betrayed him. His pulse pounded in his ears. Betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected from the woman he'd once dismissed as harmless. His wife, his quiet, compliant wife, had blindsided him. "When did this happen?" Alexander asked, the words clipped and cold. "About 2 weeks ago," Richard replied steadily. "She's been moving quietly, buying up assets tied to the condo project. The land is just one piece. She's locked down one of our supplier contracts and even secured a stake in the development rights." Alexander gripped the window frame so hard the muscles in his forearm trembled. He had underestimated her. There was no denying that now. But how had she done it right under his nose? Who was backing her? Questions burned holes through the remnants of his pride. "I want everything," Alexander said, spinning back to face Richard. "Who she's working with, how she's paying for it, and what her angle is. Find out everything. Fast." Richard nodded, already scooping up his laptop and files. "I'll have a full report on your desk by tomorrow." When the door clicked shut behind him, Alexander let out a shaky exhale and collapsed back into his chair, one hand dragging through his hair. His mind churned through every scenario. Vivian, his Vivian, had never shown open interest in the gritty parts of his empire. She had always been the elegant fixture at his side, the polished wife who made him look good while staying comfortably silent. But that version of her no longer existed. She was a player now, and she was rewriting the rules he had always taken for granted. The realization made his jaw clench with fury, and something else too, a sharp, grudging intrigue at just how far she might go. His phone buzzed across the table, snapping him out of the thought. It was a message from Sienna. "Dinner tonight? Let's unwind." He ignored it, his mind chained to one name, Vivian. This wasn't just a business blow. She had made it pointedly personal. And now he had to figure out how to counter her without letting anger blind his next move. Later that evening, Alexander sat alone in the penthouse living room, the city skyline glowing softly through the vast windows. A glass of bourbon sweated in his hand, barely touched. The television murmured in the background with the sound muted, long forgotten. His thoughts circled the same question over and over. What is Vivian planning next? He pulled up her contact on his phone, his thumb hovering over the call icon. Part of him wanted to confront her right now, to demand to know how she'd done it, why she'd done it. But deep down, he knew better. Calling her while his pulse still raced would only hand her more leverage. Vivian was unflappable under pressure. Any slip on his part, and she'd seize on it without mercy. He set the phone back down and sank deeper into the couch, eyes fixed on the ceiling's crown molding as if the answer might appear there. He needed to think like her, anticipate her next angle, corner her before she closed the trap any tighter around his prized project. As the hours slipped by, one thing solidified in his mind. Vivian was no longer the compliant woman he'd once believed she'd always be. She had changed, and if he didn't adjust faster than she did, she'd beat him at his own game. But Alexander Marshall didn't lose. Not without a fight. The heavy oak doors of the Marshall estate swung open, spilling the last rays of sunset into the marble foyer where Vivian stood waiting. Her silhouette was a study in quiet power, framed by warm gold light. She had expected this confrontation. Everything about the sharp rap of his knock had told her Alexander was exactly what she'd pictured tonight, furious, reactive, and ready to throw demands. She wore a fitted navy sheath dress that hugged her shape and commanded attention without saying a word. Every detail, down to her smooth hair and steady posture, was chosen to send a single message: she was unbreakable. Alexander strode inside without waiting for an invitation. The door shut behind him with a deep, final thud. He was still in his tailored charcoal suit, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone, his tie loosened just enough to hint at the storm that had driven him here. His trademark composure was frayed around the edges. Frustration radiated from every tense line of his frame as his eyes locked onto Vivian's unwavering calm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but ironclad. Vivian tilted her head, her expression the picture of faint, polite curiosity. "I figured you'd come eventually." He barked out a humorless laugh, raking a hand through his dark hair, as if trying to tame the chaos she had unleashed. "You think this is funny, Vivian? I just found out you've been buying up assets tied to my condo project, behind my back. What the hell do you think you're doing?" She didn't so much as flinch at the raw edge in his voice. Instead, she turned with unhurried grace and walked toward the living room, the soft click of her heels echoing off the marble floor. Alexander stalked after her, his footsteps heavier, every stride pulsing with the weight of his growing outrage. Vivian gestured smoothly for him to sit, but he ignored the offer, standing over her like a thundercloud about to break open. She settled herself in a plush leather armchair, crossing one leg over the other, her hands resting lightly on her knee, perfectly poised, perfectly unbothered. "I'm doing what any smart businesswoman would do, Alexander, seizing an opportunity." Alexander scoffed, pacing a jagged path across the room like a cornered predator. "Don't give me that. This isn't just business, and you know it. You're doing this to get back at me." Vivian lifted an eyebrow, her composure unshaken. "Are you really so self-centered that you think everything I do is about you? Don't play games with me." He snapped, spinning to face her, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You've been quietly dismantling my project piece by piece. Now you hold the keys to the whole damn thing. You could have just taken the divorce settlement and walked away, but instead you came for my company." She leaned forward a fraction, her tone soft but lined with steel. "I didn't come for your company, Alexander. I went after what I deserve." He stared at her, mind reeling as he struggled to reconcile this calculating strategist with the woman he'd once believed would always nod along, never push back. For years, Vivian had been the gracious shadow by his side, at fundraisers, at dinners, always there but never demanding space of her own. But the woman across from him now had been planning something he hadn't even seen coming. "Why now?" he asked finally, his voice dropping from rage to something more raw, confusion, maybe curiosity. "Why go to all this trouble?" Vivian exhaled, leaning back again, her eyes locked on his. "Because I spent years watching you build an empire while treating me like a decoration. I put my own ambitions aside because I believed we were a team. And then you proved I was disposable the moment someone younger and shinier came along. You left me with nothing, Alexander, or so you thought." He flinched, her words landing harder than any threat could have. He had braced for anger, for bitter tears, but not for this precise, icy truth. "You could have asked for more money in the divorce," he said, grasping for ground he no longer owned. She laughed softly, shaking her head in disbelief. "You still don't understand, do you? This was never about the money. It's about power. You taught me that, whether you meant to or not. I'm not here to destroy you, Alexander. I'm here to reclaim what you stole from me, my sense of self, my confidence, and my right to control my own future." For a heartbeat, the only sound in the room was the quiet tick of the grandfather clock standing guard in the corner. Alexander's mind flickered through every memory. Late-night fights they'd never resolved, business trips that masked his betrayals, the nights she'd waited awake and he'd convinced himself she'd never notice. He had underestimated her completely, and now he was standing in the wreckage of that mistake. "So," he said at last, voice lower now, stripped of bluster. "What's your plan?" "Now what? Are you planning to hold the project hostage until I cave?" Vivian's smile was faint but steady, no cruelty in it, only a quiet, undeniable triumph. "I don't need to hold it hostage, Alexander. I own the majority of the development rights. The key suppliers answer to me now, and the investors trust my vision more than they trust yours. I'm not here to bargain. I'm here to lead." Alexander sank into the couch across from her, the full weight of her words pressing down like a lead blanket. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, truly cornered. His entire identity had been built on the illusion that he controlled every piece of his world. Vivian had stripped that away, elegantly, ruthlessly, and without ever raising her voice. "You're serious," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I am," she said simply. "But I'm not here to destroy you, Alexander. I could have, believe me, but that's not what I want. This was never about revenge. It's about taking back what's mine." He looked up at her then, his eyes guarded but searching. "So what do you want from me now?" Vivian rose, smoothing a wrinkle from her dress as she crossed to the window. She stood there a moment, framed by the glittering cityscape, the skyline flickering like a bed of distant stars. "I want you to understand that I'm not the woman who waited in the wings for your approval anymore. I've built something of my own, and you'll have to live with that." She turned back to him, her gaze calm and unwavering. "You can fight me and lose, or you can accept that you're no longer the axis the world spins around. The choice is yours." Alexander stood slowly, adjusting his loosened tie as her words sank in. Part of him wanted to roar back, to insist he'd find a way to regain control. But deep down, he knew it. Vivian had outplayed him. There was no neat escape this time. He walked to the door, paused, and looked back at her one last time. "You've changed, Vivian." She smiled at that, soft, real, tinged with both sadness and hard-earned pride. "I had to." Without another word, Alexander pulled the door open and stepped out into the quiet night, the cold bite of his defeat pressing down on his shoulders like iron chains. Vivian watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she'd pictured so many nights while the city slept, the climax of every careful move she'd made. But as the door clicked shut behind him, she knew deep in her bones, this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she held the reins. Vivian poured herself a glass of deep red wine and settled into the armchair where Alexander had been just moments earlier. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Marshall had learned what it meant to lose. The overhead lights in the office buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow across the dim space. Alexander sat hunched at his massive oak desk, once a throne of power, now buried beneath scattered reports, scribbled notes, and abandoned coffee cups. His crisp dress shirt sleeves were shoved up to his elbows, the fine fabric rumpled and forgotten, like the man wearing it. The air was stale with the faint bite of old bourbon still lingering in the half-empty glass at his elbow. The digital clock on the wall glowed an unkind 2:45 a.m., but sleep wasn't even a distant thought. He scrolled through page after page on his laptop, his eyes sweeping over numbers that mocked him with every line. Losses, delays, emails full of thinly veiled investor panic. Each click of the mouse felt like nails driving deeper into the coffin he'd built with his own arrogance. The condo project was a grenade missing its pin, and the tick of disaster was pounding inside his skull. Vivian's name glared back at him from every corner of the mess, in contracts, in supply chain amendments, in the deeds she now owned outright. She hadn't just wounded him. She had boxed him in with surgical precision. The humiliation burned hotter than any financial loss. She had become the threat he never thought to prepare for. He sank back in his leather chair, exhaling hard, scrubbing both hands over his face. The knot in his chest wasn't just the crushing weight of financial ruin. It was knowing the woman he'd once seen as a harmless ornament had brought him to his knees, and done it without him even seeing the blade. And somewhere beneath the rage, an unfamiliar ache pulsed, a grudging respect he didn't know what to do with. The buzz of his phone cracked through the heavy silence. Alexander squinted at the screen. "Sienna." He hesitated, then answered, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "Sienna." "Alexander, where are you?" Her voice was soft, but the sharp edge beneath it was impossible to miss. "I thought we had dinner tonight." He pinched the bridge of his nose, staring at the mountain of papers in front of him. "I'm at the office. I forgot." A pause, just long enough for the disappointment to settle in. Then her voice colder. "You've been forgetting a lot lately." He let out a rough sigh, fingers dragging through his disheveled hair. "Sienna, I don't have time for this right now." Silence, and when she spoke again, her tone was icy enough to cut skin. "You don't have time for anything that isn't your empire, Alexander. Maybe that's why you're losing your grip on everything." Her words hit him harder than he expected, harder than she probably intended, or maybe exactly as she meant. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached, fighting the surge of anger that threatened to spill. "I'm not losing control." "Really?" Sienna's laugh was sharp and short. "Because from where I'm standing, you're drowning. Your investors are backing away. Your crown jewel is falling apart, and your ex-wife is running circles around you. Enough." He snapped, slamming his palm against the desk so hard the echo bounced off the office walls. The sharp crack of wood, meeting flesh, did nothing to calm the riot in his chest. It only reminded him how little control he had left when it truly mattered. Silence crackled through the phone until Sienna spoke again, her voice softer, almost weary. "I'm trying to help you, Alexander, but you won't let anyone in." "I don't need help," he bit out, though even he could hear how empty the words sounded now. They felt like a lifeline fraying in his mouth. "Suit yourself," Sienna said, her tone shifting to resigned coldness. "But don't expect me to stand by and watch you burn everything to the ground." The line went dead. The abrupt silence that followed felt louder than her words. Alexander stared down at the phone in his hand, her parting shot slicing through what little armor he had left. She was right, he was drowning. But admitting that, even to himself, felt like laying down arms. And surrender had never been in his vocabulary, even if every instinct screamed that he was already bleeding out. The next morning, Alexander showed up at the luxury condo construction site, hoping the sheer reality of steel beams and poured concrete would restore some sense of control. The sharp morning air carried the tang of fresh cement and sawdust. Workers in bright hard hats moved like clockwork through the skeletal frame of what should have been his crowning achievement. But standing there, he felt more like a stranger peering into a dream slipping through his fingers. Each unfinished beam mocked him in silence. Every exposed nail, a testament to the power he no longer wielded alone. Greg, the project manager, a broad-shouldered man who had shepherded many of Alexander's past developments, greeted him with a grim nod and led him through the chaos. Greg's boots crunched across scattered gravel as he pointed out delays and exposed gaps in walls that should have been finished weeks ago. "We're bleeding money, boss," Greg said, dragging a sleeve across his sweaty forehead. "If the materials don't hit the site by next week, we're looking at another month behind schedule." Alexander's mind raced, but he kept his face locked in that cold, practiced calm. "What about the supplier? What's the holdup?" Greg shifted awkwardly, glancing away. "New management. Vivian Marshall, to be exact. Word is she's renegotiating contracts and, well, she's not exactly bumping our shipment to the front of the line." A bitter pulse twisted in Alexander's gut. He didn't need to ask twice. He knew exactly what Vivian was doing. Slow-walking deliveries was her way of squeezing him dry, tightening the vise until he had no option but to bend or break. And the worst part? She had done it clean. No dirty tricks to drag into court. No loophole to exploit. She'd played by the book and still cornered him like an amateur. And somewhere, in the deepest part of him, a grudging admiration flickered to life. Uninvited and infuriating. Back in his car, Alexander gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles paled to bone white. Failure. Real, suffocating, impossible to spin failure. Pressed down on his chest until he could barely draw breath. He had spent his whole life telling himself there was no problem he couldn't solve, no rival he couldn't outmaneuver. But this time, the enemy wasn't a hostile boardroom or a stubborn investor. This time, it was the woman who had once waited at home for him to remember she existed, now reminding him exactly who she had always been capable of becoming. And for the first time, Alexander Marshall realized that maybe he had built an empire too blind to see where the real power had always lived. It was personal. Vivian had made sure of that. By evening, Alexander was back in his penthouse, the glittering city skyline sprawling before him like an accusation. The breathtaking view that had once symbolized everything he'd conquered now mocked him with a reminder of what he was on the verge of losing. It felt like every light outside his window pulsed with her name, proof of what he'd failed to keep under his thumb. He poured himself another glass of bourbon, watching the amber swirl mimic the chaos crashing through his thoughts. The sharp ring of the doorbell cut through his trance. He set the glass down and crossed the marble floor, surprised when he opened the door to find Sienna standing there. Her face was unreadable. She wore a sleek black coat, her hair falling in glossy waves over her shoulders like a spill of dark silk. "I thought you were done with me," he said, leaning lazily against the doorframe, masking his exhaustion with forced indifference. Every muscle in his body begged for sleep he knew wouldn't come. "I should be," she replied coolly, stepping past him into the penthouse without waiting for permission. "But I'm not." Alexander shut the door and followed her into the living room, watching as she shrugged off her coat and draped it over the back of a leather chair. "You look like hell," she said bluntly, her eyes flicking over him with a mix of worry and exasperation. "Thanks for the pep talk," he muttered, dropping heavily onto the couch. Sienna sat across from him, crossing her long legs with effortless grace. "Face it, Alexander, you can't keep pretending this will magically fix itself." He raked a hand through his hair, the tension in his shoulders heavy enough to crush him. "I know." The confession tasted like defeat on his tongue, but it was the first truth he hadn't twisted in weeks. For a fleeting moment, her expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, he glimpsed the woman who had once truly believed in him. "Then do something about it," she said firmly. "Talk to Vivian. Find a way to negotiate, even if it means swallowing that monstrous pride of yours." Alexander stared at her, the thought of going to Vivian cutting deeper than he cared to admit, humiliating and yet painfully unavoidable. He had spent years convincing himself that needing anyone was weakness. Now, with everything teetering on the edge, that belief felt like the most foolish lie of all. All his empires, all his walls, undone by the one person he'd underestimated most. "Maybe you're right," he murmured at last, his voice so low it barely filled the space between them. Sienna allowed herself a faint, knowing smile as she stood and reached for her coat. "I'm always right. You just never listen." She slipped out the door, leaving him alone with the echo of her words. Alexander sank deeper into the couch, staring past the city lights he'd once thought he owned. He knew exactly what he had to do, but the real question burned through his mind like a dare. Would Vivian even hear him out? Or was this just another lesson in losing what he'd always believed he could control? The air inside the boardroom vibrated with a silent charge, like static before a storm breaks. The glass walls and polished mahogany panels caught every sound and magnified it. The click of designer heels on marble, the muted shuffle of papers, the restless tap of pens against notepads. Arrayed around the long, gleaming conference table sat men and women in tailored suits, each representing a piece of Alexander Marshall's fractured empire. But today, they weren't here to talk profits or expansion. They were here to witness a reckoning. At the head of the table sat Vivian Marshall, unmistakably poised, a quiet storm wrapped in navy and white. Her tailored blazer hugged her frame, crisp blouse immaculate, a delicate gold necklace resting at her collarbone catching the light as she glanced down at the papers in front of her. Power radiated from her stillness, grace wrapped around steel. Her posture was flawless. Her fingers rested lightly on the agenda laid neatly in front of her. The air around her seemed calm, almost deceptively so, but her eyes were sharp, focused, and utterly commanding. Vivian had prepared for this day with painstaking precision. There was no margin for error. The quiet hum of shuffling papers and whispered side conversations snapped to silence as the door opened. Every head turned. Alexander Marshall walked in. Once, his mere entrance would have been enough to fill a room with unchallenged authority. Now, an unfamiliar tension clung to his every step. His charcoal suit was immaculately tailored, but the stiff set of his shoulders betrayed the crushing pressure pressing on him from all sides. His eyes swept the conference room, lingering on Vivian just a fraction longer than he intended. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. She met his stare with the unwavering composure of someone who had already claimed victory and no longer needed to prove it. Alexander dropped into the seat at the far end of the table, setting down his leather briefcase with a force that sent a faint thud reverberating through the room. "Let's get this over with," he muttered under his breath. But the microphone caught every syllable, earning him a few side-eyed glances from the board members. Vivian cleared her throat softly, a sound so subtle yet powerful enough to pull every eye back to her. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice smooth and impossibly steady. You've been briefed on the agenda, but before we move forward, I want to address the future of Marshall Development Group. The words hung in the air like a blade poised to drop. Alexander's fingers dug into the armrests of his chair, knuckles whitening as he braced for the impact he knew was coming. As many of you know, Vivian continued, each word deliberate but free of malice, over the last few months, I have been acquiring strategic assets connected to the luxury condo project. I now hold a controlling interest in the development rights, the key supplier contracts, and the adjoining land parcel necessary for expansion. A ripple of whispers coursed through the room. Executives leaned toward one another, exchanging quick, startled glances, their voices a muted current of speculation. Alexander stayed silent, his jaw so tight it might have cracked. Vivian picked up the conference room remote and pressed a button. Instantly, the large screen at the head of the table glowed to life, displaying a crisp, unforgiving presentation. The first slide was a brutal financial breakdown, ballooning costs, repeated delays, investor unrest. Each data point laid out so precisely there was no oxygen left for denial. As you can see, Vivian said, gesturing to the screen without even looking back at it, this project has encountered significant obstacles. However, with decisive leadership and a strategic realignment, there is a clear, profitable path forward. She didn't have to raise her voice to command the room, but Alexander could not keep quiet another second. Leadership? His voice cracked through the tension like a whip. You think you can just waltz in here and take over this? My project, Alexander snapped. Vivian didn't blink. Correction. It was your project. Now it's mine. A wave of silence spread through the room. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning overhead. Alexander leaned forward, elbows braced on the table, his glare locked on her like a loaded weapon. You think you've won because you've cornered me, but you have no idea what it takes to run a development this size. You're out of your depth, Vivian. She smiled then, but it wasn't the warm, gentle smile he'd once known. This was the smile of a woman who'd learned exactly how to dismantle him piece by piece. That's where you're wrong, she said evenly. I spent years sitting quietly at the end of this table, listening to you strategize and close deals. I took notes, I absorbed everything, and I waited for the day I could use it. This isn't me being out of my depth, Alexander. This is me proving I was always capable. You just never bothered to see it. Around them, board members shifted uncomfortably, the tension crackling in the polished room, but no one dared look away. Alexander let out a sharp breath and raked a hand through his hair, the facade of calm cracking with each second. So what's this? Some grand revenge tour? You want to humiliate me? Tear down everything I built? No, she said, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to fix what you broke. The investors don't trust you anymore, Alexander. They've seen the delays, the cost overruns, the excuses. They want someone who can deliver, and that's why they've agreed to back my leadership. Alexander's eyes flicked desperately around the room, searching for even a flicker of loyalty, but all he found were lowered gazes and turned faces. Even the allies who had once backed him without question now avoided his eyes. Their silence said everything. For the first time in his career, Alexander Marshall realized he was standing on a foundation that had quietly rotted out from under him. Vivian's tone didn't waver for a heartbeat. Effective immediately, I will assume the role of lead developer for this project. My team and I have a revised timeline and budget ready, which will be presented in detail after this meeting. Our goal is simple: stabilize the project, rebuild investor confidence, and deliver on the promises you failed to keep. It felt like the air had been punched out of him. He had walked in braced for a battle. He hadn't expected to lose the entire war before he'd spoken more than a handful of words. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. What was left to say? She had outplayed him at every turn, and now she was delivering the final strike in front of the very people who had once crowned him untouchable. As the meeting wound down, Vivian rose and gathered her papers, each movement precise, graceful, deliberate. She turned to the board members, offering them a polite, composed smile. Thank you for your time and support. I look forward to working with each of you. One by one, the room began to empty, executives drifting out with murmured goodbyes and careful glances toward Alexander, who who remained frozen at his seat, staring at the polished table as if it might whisper back the answers he'd lost. When the boardroom was nearly deserted, Vivian approached him. The soft click of her heels on the marble floor broke the tense silence between them. "This doesn't have to be the end for you, Alexander," she said quietly, her tone gentle but firm. "You're still a brilliant businessman, but maybe it's time you understood that success isn't about controlling every piece on the board. It's about knowing when to adapt." He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with a mix of stubborn anger and something more fragile, something that might have been regret. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, the question rough in his throat. She paused, considering her words with care. "Because I need to prove to myself that I can. And maybe, just maybe, you need to see it too." She didn't wait for his reply. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving Alexander alone with the echo of her footsteps and the heavy finality of defeat. The pale morning light crept through the curtains of Alexander Marshall's penthouse, stretching soft beams across the gleaming hardwood floors. The room was so still it felt hollow. Only the faint hum of early city traffic and a lone bird outside the window disturbed the silence. Alexander lay half-sprawled on the leather couch, still in yesterday's clothes, his shirt rumpled, tie loosened, the ghost of bourbon clinging to him more stubbornly than sleep ever could. An empty glass perched on the coffee table, beside a bottle that was more air than liquor now, a testament to another night spent wrestling with what he'd lost. The boardroom meeting was 2 days past, but the memory looped relentlessly. Vivian's calm dismantling of every defense he'd clung to, the board's quiet surrender to her authority, and the cruel truth that his empire was no longer his alone to command. He'd built everything with his own 2 hands, convinced that iron-willed ambition could outpace any threat. But ambition hadn't saved him from the one person who had always known where to strike. A sharp knock startled him out of the haze. He sat up slowly, scrubbing his eyes and raking a hand through his tousled hair. The knocking came again, louder this time, insistent, as if whoever was on the other side knew he'd rather pretend not to hear. With a resigned groan, Alexander forced himself off the couch and trudged to the door. He didn't bother checking who it was. He didn't have the energy to care. When he swung the door open, he found Vivian standing there, impeccably dressed in a tailored beige coat that cinched perfectly at her waist. Her hair fell smooth and polished around her shoulders, and the faint scent of jasmine drifted past him as she stepped inside, not waiting for permission. Her heels tapped a quiet command into the marble floor as she brushed by him. "You've certainly seen better days," she said, her tone cool but not unkind. She remarked dryly, her eyes drifting to the cluttered living room and the half-empty bourbon bottle on the table. Alexander closed the door behind her and leaned against it, watching her with a mix of exhaustion and wary curiosity. "What are you doing here, Vivian? Haven't you done enough?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here to gloat, if that's what you're assuming." "Then why are you here?" His voice carried an edge of bitterness, but beneath it lay a raw thread of vulnerability he could no longer hide. Vivian sighed, crossing her arms loosely. "Because I wanted to give you a chance. I know what it feels like when the world caves in on you, Alexander. I've been there, remember? But I also know you're not the kind of man who quits without a fight." He scoffed and pushed himself to the couch, sinking into the cushions with a heavy exhale. "You've done a spectacular job proving otherwise." She crossed the room and settled into the armchair opposite him. Her posture was straight but not rigid, her presence calm yet firm. "I didn't do this to destroy you. I did it to reclaim my life. There's a difference." Alexander leaned forward, bracing his elbows on his knees, hands rubbing together like he could scrub away what he didn't want to feel. "And now that you've taken it all, what do you expect me to do? Start from scratch?" "No," she said softly, unwavering. "I expect you to adapt." He lifted his head slowly, her words weighing heavier than any accusation. Adapt. It was a foreign word to him. His entire legacy had been forged by plowing straight through obstacles, never yielding an inch. But now, that iron will had failed him, and the idea of changing course felt at once terrifying and necessary. "Vivian," he said after a long silence, his voice hoarse, "how did you do it? How did you go from being the woman who sat quietly beside me to abyss. A faint, wistful smile curved her lips, her gaze softening with memories too old and too heavy to name. It wasn't easy. There were nights I didn't believe I could, days I wanted to run. But every time I felt like quitting, I thought of all the years I spent helping you build your empire while burying my own dreams. And I realized, if I could help you build yours, I could damn well build my own. Alexander swallowed hard, guilt thick in his throat like stones he couldn't spit out. I never meant to make you feel like that. I know, she said gently, her tone forgiving but unflinching. But intention doesn't erase impact. They fell into a silence that, for the first time in years, didn't crackle with resentment. The city hummed far below them, but in that moment, the penthouse felt suspended outside of time. What happens now? Alexander asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Vivian studied him for a long moment before she answered. That depends on you. I have no intention of shutting you out of the project completely. If you're willing to work with me, we can turn this around, together. Alexander blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected olive branch. You're serious? Completely, Vivian said without hesitation. But there are conditions. Of course there are, he muttered, leaning back against the couch, trying to mask the flicker of relief sparking in his chest. Let's hear them. For starters, you'll have to let go of your need to control everything. This project isn't just yours anymore, it's ours. If you can accept that, then we can make it work. Alexander sat with her words for a moment. The thought of sharing control was foreign, uncomfortable even, but not entirely unappealing. For the first time in far too long, he saw a thin, fragile thread of hope, a way out of the wreckage he'd made. And the second condition? He asked. Vivian smiled then, not the guarded, businesslike smile he'd seen at the boardroom table, but something softer, almost familiar. The smile of the woman he had once loved and foolishly taken for granted. You have to accept that I'm not the woman I was when you left me behind. I'm not here to be your sidekick or your support system. I'm your equal. If you can't respect that, then this partnership is dead before it starts. He nodded slowly, the truth of her words settling somewhere deep in his ribs, uncomfortably right. I understand. Do you? She asked, holding his gaze without blinking. Because if you don't, this conversation ends now. I do, he said firmly, his voice clearer than it had been in days. I understand. She stood, brushing an invisible crease from her tailored coat as she prepared to leave. Good. Then we'll talk more at the next meeting. For now, get some rest. You're gonna need it. Alexander rose too, watching her cross the living room toward the door, her calm authority leaving a trail of resolve in her wake. Vivian. She paused, turning back to him. Yes, thank you, he said, and the words carried a weight he hadn't felt in a long time. Humility and maybe, just maybe, hope. She nodded once, giving him one last faint, warm smile before stepping out into the hallway. When the door clicked shut behind her, Alexander stood in the silence, a strange mix of belief and determination coursing through him. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in weeks, he saw a way forward. And he knew he wouldn't be walking it alone. The crisp morning breeze carried the soft perfume of blooming flowers, blending with the distant hum of a city waking to a new day. Vivian Marshall stood on the rooftop garden of her newly acquired office building, her eyes fixed on the horizon where sunlight gilded the glass towers of downtown Chicago. The view was magnificent, but it wasn't the skyline that filled her chest with quiet pride. It was the path she'd walked to stand here at all. The rooftop garden, stone pathways winding between neatly tended greenery and clusters of lavender, had been designed as a symbol of growth and renewal, a reflection of the woman she had become. Dressed in a fitted cream blazer and tailored trousers, she radiated quiet power. Her heels clicked softly over the stone as she made her way to a polished wooden bench nestled among the lavender. In her hand was a leather-bound notebook, its pages brimming with ideas and plans, blueprints not just for buildings but for the next bold chapter of her life. She sat down, the gentle sunlight warming her face as she flipped open the notebook to a fresh page. Her pen hovered for a heartbeat before gliding smoothly across the paper, ink flowing in tandem with the thoughts forming in her mind. This wasn't just another to-do list or a string of business goals. It was a declaration. She had reclaimed her power, But now she wanted more than control. She wanted to leave a legacy, something enduring enough to outlive the trials she had survived to get here. Each word she wrote felt like a promise whispered to the version of herself who once believed she had none of this strength. The soft sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Vivian glanced up and smiled as Caroline, her best friend and unshakable confidant, appeared at the edge of the rooftop garden. Casual in jeans and a light jacket, Caroline held out 2 paper coffee cups, her warm grin as comforting as ever. "I figured you could use a caffeine boost," Caroline said, handing 1 cup to Vivian before sinking onto the bench beside her. "You know me too well," Vivian said, her voice carrying a quiet laugh. She took a sip, the rich warmth of the coffee grounding her in a way few things could. It was a small reminder of how deeply she'd come to value the simple moments she'd once overlooked. Moments like this, where power didn't need to roar to remind her it existed inside her now. Caroline's eyes flicked to the leather-bound notebook resting on Vivian's lap, curiosity dancing in her grin. "More plans for world domination?" Vivian let out a soft laugh, closing the notebook and placing it gently on the bench beside her. "Something like that." She turned slightly, her tone shifting to thoughtful certainty. "I've been thinking about what comes next." Caroline leaned back, her eyes twinkling with intrigue. "Tell me." "I want to expand the development work beyond luxury high-rises," Vivian said, her voice steady and sure. "I want to create spaces that actually serve people. Affordable housing, public parks, art centers. I've spent enough of my life chasing profit margins. Now I want to build something that matters." Her words felt heavier than concrete foundations. This time her blueprints would shape more than steel and glass. They would shape lives. Caroline's smile grew, pride softening her features. "That sounds exactly like the Vivian I've always believed in." Vivian's gaze drifted back to the skyline, where sunlight brushed the glass towers with gold. "It feels right. For so long I was obsessed with proving something. To Alexander, to the board, even to myself. But now, I don't feel like I need to prove a damn thing. I just want to build something I can be proud of." The weight of that truth settled over them like a gentle hush, a testament to how far she had come. There had been a time when her worth was tethered entirely to Alexander's spotlight, when her value was measured by how seamlessly she supported his dreams. But now, she was writing her own story, this time as the main character, not the quiet footnote. The thought alone was a freedom sweeter than any victory in a boardroom. Caroline nudged her playfully, laughter bubbling in her voice. "You do realize you're basically the talk of the city right now, right? The woman who outplayed Alexander Marshall and walked away holding his crown jewel." "It's practically legendary," Caroline teased, grinning wide. Vivian chuckled, shaking her head at her friend's dramatic tone. "I didn't do it for the headlines, but you did make them," Caroline pressed. "And people are paying attention. Investors are talking about you. Clients are lining up to work with you. Even the board members who doubted you at first are singing your praises now. You've shown everyone that you're a force to be reckoned with, Vivian." Vivian took another sip of her coffee, letting its warmth settle through her bones. She appreciated Caroline's unwavering support. She always had. But what mattered most now wasn't what others thought. It was the quiet certainty in her own heart. This peace, she realized, wasn't given to her by anyone. She had earned every breath of it. The road had been anything but smooth. There were nights she'd lain awake, questioning every choice, days when the burden of her ambition felt too heavy to bear. But each setback had forged something stronger in her. Now, standing at the peak of what she'd fought to reclaim, she knew, without a doubt, it had been worth it. She was no longer surviving in someone else's shadow. She was thriving in her own sun. They sat in a lull of easy silence, the morning breeze playing with a few stray strands of her hair, until Vivian's phone buzzed against the bench. She glanced at the screen. "Alexander, can we meet?" "Just to talk." Her fingers hovered over the message. She didn't reply, yet. The memory of their last conversation flickered through her mind, the moment he'd stopped fighting and, for once, listened. She'd seen traces of the man she had once loved fiercely, the man whose ambition had inspired her before greed and ego had clouded him. Part of her wondered if he truly could change, if he could build something new from the wreckage, like she had. But she also knew now, whether he did or didn't would never define her again. Caroline, who never missed a thing, caught the hesitation. She arched an eyebrow. "Alexander?" Vivian nodded, locking the phone and placing it face down beside her. "He wants to meet." "And do you want to see him?" Caroline asked gently. Vivian turned her gaze back to the skyline, the city alive and humming beneath the rising sun. "I don't know. There's a part of me that wants closure, but another part wonders if opening that door again is worth the risk." Caroline squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "You don't owe him anything, Vivian. If you feel ready, meet him. If you don't, that's fine too. Just make sure you do it for you, not for him." Vivian nodded, absorbing her friend's words like armor. For so long she had made choices to keep others happy. Not this time. The decision, whatever it would be, was hers alone. And for the first time, that thought didn't frighten her. It steadied her. She slipped the phone back into her bag, giving herself permission to wait. Below them, a burst of laughter rose from the street. Vivian leaned over the edge of the rooftop and spotted a little girl chasing a bright balloon while her mother watched, laughing too. The sight brought an unbidden smile to her lips. A simple, perfect reminder that there was beauty in chaos, light in all the noise. She turned back to Caroline, her resolve settling into something solid. "I think I'm ready to close that chapter. Whether I meet Alexander or not, it won't change what I've built or where I'm going. But it might help me let it all go." Caroline nodded, pride shining in her eyes. "Then do it on your terms." As the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the rooftops in the city below, Vivian felt a deep, resounding calm. Her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. And with or without Alexander, she knew exactly who she was, and that truth was worth more than any victory she had ever fought for, she had ever won. Later that afternoon, Vivian found herself back in her office, carefully reviewing the final details of the community project proposal. Outside her window, the steady hum of construction filled the air, a living testament to how far she'd come and how much further she intended to go. Every clang of metal and hum of machinery reminded her that she wasn't just building structures, she was building proof of who she had become. She signed the last page with a decisive stroke and leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow, satisfied breath. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Alexander. It was a notification from one of the investors she'd been courting, a confirmation of their support for her next ambitious project. Vivian's lips curved into a quiet, genuine smile. Another stone lifted off her shoulders, another reminder that the only validation she truly needed now was her own. With each step forward, she was proving, to the world and to herself, that she could not just survive but thrive, entirely on her own terms. No man's name, no board's approval. No whisper of gossip could touch this certainty now. She gathered her things, carefully tucking away her notebook before standing to leave. For a heartbeat, she paused, letting the swell of hard-earned pride fill the stillness of the room. This room, once just another corner in Alexander's empire, was now hers, claimed and conquered without raising her voice. She had fought for this life, endured betrayal, heartbreak, and the dismantling of everything she once thought defined her worth. And she had emerged stronger than ever, standing taller for every scar she'd earned. With her head high and her resolve unshakable, Vivian Marshall walked out of her office, ready to face whatever waited beyond those doors. The world was hers now, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly how to claim it. So the story is over. But my wonderful friends, are you still here with me at this late hour? If you are, then I know that somehow, somewhere, Vivian's journey has stirred something in your heart. Maybe a quiet strength, maybe a question about your own dreams, or maybe Vivian taught us that sometimes life knocks us down in the cruelest ways. Betrayal, humiliation, being overlooked by the very ones we trust the most. But in the ashes of what breaks us, we covrage. You know, there's a quote I love by Haruki Murakami, and once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through. But one thing is certain, when Vivian is proof of his. Her story reminds us that power is not about control, but about owning our worth when no one else believes in it yet. It's about rewriting the narrative others wrote for us, with quiet grace, fierce resolve, and a soul that refuses to stay silent. So, to you who stayed here till the end, may you carry this message with you tonight. Never underestimate your quiet strength. Never let someone else decide your worth. And even if they walk away, you will rise, rewrite, and reclaim every piece of you they thought they broke. If this story touched you, until next time, take a deep breath, hold your head high, and remember, you are more than enough.